Okay. I'm going to have, now we're going to switch gears here. And I'm going to introduce Bruce and with, I gotta, I may have to just ad lib this. Oh, here we go. Well, first I should introduce this, and I'm going to just admit somebody. Actually, I think, you know what? I think it's best for Bruce to do his own biography, because his own biography helps him come to his subject matter. So I'm gonna start there. What I will say is for the last several months, every other Tuesday, and then for the last month and a half, every Tuesday, I got to meet with, or we have a Zoom meeting with Bruce Rogers-Vaughn and Bruce Wall, and it was one of the most intellectual, exciting times. I felt like I was back in college and graduate school, really thinking out ideas, and it's like a young person who's just experiencing all of these big thoughts. And I remember being Gabriella's age and going to a college class, and they would be having new professors interview. And I would go listen to those interviews, because it would be taking like a super learning pill. And I would digest that all. And I just, I just enjoyed it. And but being around both Bruces for me was like a wonderful learning pill. And it was fun. And they're both very good souls themselves. And it was a great experience being around them. And but Bruce did some very special work, and I'm going to let him describe that, but caring for souls in a neoliberal age. So let's look at some of the effects, and let's see what works for us to move monetary reform forward. This is a new, and if I don't mind, I'm going to borrow Bruce's words here. This is a deep well by which we can go down and bring up a lot of important information to help move the cause and to help think about it. So there's a lot more research to be done in this area, and I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to let Bruce take over. Thank you, Bruce, for being here.
Thank you, Stephen. And I assume you set this up so that I can share my screen for the PowerPoint.
Yes, I'm sure that's done.
Let me go ahead and get that set up so we'll be ready to go. Is that showing up?
Yes, it's in the with the thumbnails to the side.
How's that?
No, perfect.
And you may want to set it up in the side-by-side format. Let me see if I can get it in that format as well.
You want the thumbnails or just your picture or something?
I'd like the PowerPoint to be to the left of the presenter view, so that you can see me on the right of the slide.
Yeah, that's automatic. That's already
okay, so
being,
that's how it's showing up. Great.
okay, yeah.
I want to thank the leadership of AMI first for inviting me to present at this conference, and especially to Stephen and Bruce Wall, who, as Stephen said, we have enjoyed some wonderful conversations over the past weeks and months. I suppose I'm a rather unusual presenter, I assume, for AMI. I am a practicing psychotherapist. I've been practicing psychotherapy since the 1980s, mid-80s. But I'm also an ordained Christian minister, Baptist, and a Christian theologian. And I suspect someone of my identity is not your usual presenter at AMI. So I automatically will have some a different perspective, I guess, to bring to this subject today. I'm going to jump right in because this is a complex topic, and there's quite a bit of ground to cover, in other words. So I'm going to jump in. You can read my bio on the conference website if you wish. So I'll skip that. I'm going to be talking about money today from a perspective that's, I think, not common in monetary reform conversations, because I'm not going to be focusing on law or monetary policy per se, but rather on the impact of money on our humanity. In particular, I want to underscore how the current money system creates and shapes our suffering, and how it might instead engender hope. Regarding our suffering, we normally think only of how a lack of money is the problem that creates human suffering, as if money were neutral, just a method of accounting. But I'm going to talk instead about how money in and of itself does things that cause suffering for human beings and for the planet. It is not just an object. Money is a human process, a technology that both causes and transforms suffering, and thus is morally significant in and of itself, not just in how we use it, but in how it is created and allocated. My argument is similar to one made by Ezra Klein about 2 months ago in the New York Times. He had an op-ed piece, and he concluded, "I didn't want it to be true, but the medium really is the message." And in the essay, he recounts how the internet and social media and smartphones and so forth have not just been neutral tools, but have transformed individuals and society as a whole in damaging ways. So he writes here, this is the conclusion of the essay. He says, "This is anything but an argument against technology, were such a thing even coherent. It's an argument for taking technology as seriously as it deserves to be taken, for recognizing that we shape our tools and thereafter they shape us. There's an optimism in that, a reminder of our own agency, and there are questions posed, ones we should spend more time and energy trying to answer. How do we want to be shaped? Who do we want to become?" The photograph that accompanied the essay, the op-ed piece in the New York Times, shows over the course of an hour, it's a composite photo showing over the course of an hour, people in front of the government center in Boston, portraying how this technology has isolated us and actually altered our humanity. Many studies now have shown that human well-being depends on face-to-face interactions and community, and that the lack of embodied presence alienates us from self and others, and thus fuels increasing rates of mental and physical pathologies. The article cites Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows. Some of you have maybe have seen that, what the internet is doing to our brains. He does not mention Sherry Turkle's book, Alone Together, but I highly recommend that, about how this same technology is changing human relationships and dismantling human relationships. I want to pause and ask you to please understand that I'm not simply using Klein's essay as a metaphor. I'm using it literally. I'm saying the same thing is true of money, which was an analog technology long before it became a digital technology. What Klein does not clarify is that the internet did not arise in a social void. The internet was created and utilized in ways that served particular corporate and political interests. This is why it is not a morally neutral tool. It's the same with money. Money is not necessarily destructive of human life in all of its forms, in every time and place. Its precise effects on human life depends on the social and political paradigm that creates it in a particular form and allocates it in certain ways. Today, and since around 1980, That paradigm is neoliberal capitalism, which I will get to momentarily. We can put this in a narrative frame. What is the story that money tells about who we are? The visual and musical arts, as all of you know, often depict the spirit of an age. I'm going to reduce this if I can see better. Okay. Jackson Browne, who many of you know, released this album just as neoliberalism was beginning to launch. The album came out in 1976. And his portrayal of the lives of everyday working people in the album anticipated the impact of the system. The refrain of the title song, The Pretender, epitomizes the central conflict of life under neoliberalism, caught between the longing for love and the struggle for the legal tender. Money, as it is created and allocated within this system, enforces this conflict, essentially eroding our choice between the two. It eliminates our ability to choose. This form of money is scarce for the vast majority of people. It compels us to compete against each other and erodes time and other resources for loving. My psychotherapy practice today is filled with people caught in this elemental conflict between the longing for love and the struggle for the legal tender. And it's the basis for much of their depression, anxiety, loneliness, and addiction. So please keep this core conflict in mind as I move forward in the presentation, because I'm arguing that money is the core of the enforcement of this conflict, a conflict that is not necessary, but the money system we have today enforces it. In the context of neoliberalism, I would argue that money itself is a pretense. It holds out the promise of success, abundance, and even the satisfaction of our longing for love. All the while, it constructs a world in which these desires are constantly frustrated. Money today creates this conflict, and by the conflict, again, I'm referring to the longing for love and the struggle for the legal tender. It recreates this conflict at the heart of economics, politics, culture, and even at the granular level in our everyday lives. When I speak here of love, by the way, I do not mean something romantic or sentimental. I'm referring to a deep sense of connection with other people, of community, of a solidarity that binds our well-being to that of others. I'm talking about what Barbara Easley Cox means when she summarizes her work with the Black Panther Party in the 60s and 70s. By the way, this book, Comrade Sisters, is a photojournalistic book that I don't think has been released yet. So if you want it, you can go pre-order it somewhere. But Cox says, love is what tied me to the party. It exemplified how I understood love. And that is, you have to love people to serve them. I was so loved, so blessed on this earth because of my sisters, all of us who came into the party. And then she reflects on society as a whole. It is lacking today, even when I look out on this landscape in America. She's referring, of course, to the United States. And if you ask me what this love looks like, this is what it looks like. So here are women of the Black Panther Party working in the free food program just 4 years after Jackson Brown, or before Jackson Brown's article was released. This is how love looks. So now to the question of what is neoliberalism, I want to pause and say, I'm basically building upon Christine Tizan's paper, who presented in the conference yesterday. I don't think she mentioned it in the oral presentation as much yesterday, but in her paper, she makes it clear that the current monetary system is, quote, hardwired under capitalism. Sometimes when we talk about monetary reform, we don't discuss the fact that the monetary system is itself shaped by an even larger social paradigm in which it is housed and which fuels it. And she made clear in the paper that the monetary system that we're trying to reform is the monetary system that capitalism built. So when we work to reform that system, you either have to think of yourself as reforming capitalism or as working against capitalism. So I'm building on her argument here, pointing to how neoliberal capitalism radicalizes this hardwiring, how money is integrated into the neoliberal worldview, and how both its effects directly through the economy and indirectly through the politics and culture it participates in, both intensify and alter human suffering. So what is neoliberalism? I'm going to cue a short video clip from Noam Chomsky, who I think summarizes it best for the purposes of this presentation. By the way, the audio on this clip is kind of low. I'm going to pause for a few seconds and let you all turn up the volume. Turn up the volume as high as you can on your computers or other devices you're listening on so that you can hear the audio clearly.
And to do that, people have to get out of full screen, I think.
Yes, you may have to get out of full screen and find the icon for your speaker and just turn it on the highest volume. Okay, here we go. Noam Chomsky.
Around the 70s, human intelligence dedicated itself to eliminating, or at least weakening, the main barrier against the threats. It's called neoliberalism. If you ask yourself there was a transition at that period from the period of what some people call regimented capitalism, 50s and 60s, the great growth period, egalitarian and growth, a lot of advances in social justice and so on. That changed in the 70s and with the onset of the neoliberal era that we've been living in since.
We deregulated the airlines. We deregulated the trucking industry. We deregulated financial institutions. We decontrolled oil and natural gas prices. And we negotiated lower trade barriers throughout the world to get rid of needless and burdensome federal regulations, which benefit nobody and which harm all of us.
And if you ask yourself what this era is, its crucial principle is undermining mechanisms of social solidarity and mutual support and popular engagement in determining policy. It's not called that. What's called is freedom.
But I'm not in favor of fairness. I'm in favor of freedom. And freedom is not fairness. Fairness means somebody has to decide what's fair.
But freedom means subordination to the decisions of concentrated, unaccountable private power. That's what it means. The institutions of governance or other kinds of association that could allow people to participate in decision-making, those are systematically weakened. Margaret Thatcher said it rather nicely in her aphorism about there is no society, only individuals. She was actually unconsciously, no doubt, paraphrasing Marx, who in his condemnation of the repression in France said the repression is turning society into a sack of potatoes, that just individuals, amorphous mass, can't act together. That was a condemnation. For Thatcher, it's an ideal. And that's neoliberalism. We destroy, or at least undermine, the governing mechanisms in which people, at least in principle, can participate to the extent the society is democratic. So weaken them, undermine unions, other forms of association, leave a sack of potatoes, and meanwhile transfer decisions to unaccountable private power, all in the rhetoric of freedom. Well, what does that do? The one barrier to the threat of destruction is an engaged public, an informed, engaged public acting together to develop means to confront the threat and respond to it. And that's systematically weakened for people to become more passive and apathetic and not to disturb things too much. And that's what the neoliberal programs do. So put it all together, and what do you have? A perfect storm.
So let me bring money back into the picture, what Noam Chomsky just talked about. He talked about neoliberalism primarily as a social paradigm that systematically weakens unions, collectives of all kinds. I wrote in my book of how it erodes, including neighborhoods, as well as religion. And the money that it creates fits in like hand in glove into this system. So money created by private for-profit banks is conjointly generated from the self-interest of the banks and those of the borrowers. Notice that neither is capable of making the common good of society a priority. That's nowhere in view. So it fits rather neatly into this system that Chomsky is talking about, that systematically erodes the public. And notice that the money born of this union therefore erodes the public itself and alienates actors from themselves and from one another. Often in our monetary reform conversations, we talk about wanting to restore public money, but I'm saying even more than that here. I'm saying that money itself, once it's created by private banks, plays a role in the erosion of the public and the separation of human beings from one another. So today, money is a neoliberal technology. Let me add, by the way, of course, the creation of money by private banks pre-exists neoliberalism. As Christine Dizon made clear in her essay, it goes all the way back to the beginnings of capitalism. What's happened in neoliberalism is that it's thrown into hyperdrive. So bank money is even more powerful than it was in the capitalism that preceded neoliberalism. Some refer to this as financialization. There's actually more, most of the money moving around the planet today is not from the sales of goods and services of production. It's actually the trading of financial derivatives is where most of the profit is coming from. So neoliberal money arises from the struggle and competition. It reproduces the conflict that I talked about earlier between the longing for love and the struggle for the legal tender at both the local and global scale. It creates its own narrative, even I would say an ontology, a reality in which scarcity replaces abundance, where there are only winners and losers or creditors and debtors, and where self-interest replaces mutual obligation, care, and love. By the way, on point 2, there's a wonderful scholar by the name of Maurizio Lazzarato, I believe is his name, that talks about that under neoliberalism, the emphasis it has displaced the capitalism that Marx talked about, which is the competition between owners and workers, and has displaced that with the competition between creditors and debtors. It's not that production and workers is no longer exists. It's just a displacement. I'm going to mention 2 books quickly in passing as kind of bookends, literally, for the history of neoliberalism. This one by Quinn Slobodian came out a couple of years ago, and he talks about the origins of neoliberalism. It's important to know that even though neoliberalism, as Chomsky pointed out, came into power under Reagan and Thatcher in roughly 1980, the ideology of neoliberalism goes all the way back to the 1920s, when the economic elites of the world came together and said, what are we going to do about the dismantling of colonialism, where we're losing control financially of the planet with all these nationalist, socialist, and democratic movements around the planet occurring. And what they basically decided was, well, good riddance, because it was really inefficient and very costly to dispatch armies to other territories and occupy them in order to expropriate the resources they had. They said, and it's also bad optics for us as the elites. So it's actually, they said, it would be much more effective and much more efficient if we could control the world through a global financial system or banking system. This is what Michael Hudson has called finance as warfare. So that is literally what neoliberalism did when it came into power in the 80s, is that it waged war on the world through the means of finance, of course, sometimes still militarily, but primarily through the IMF, the World Bank, and other financial institutions. It has managed to do the same thing as the old colonialism has done. So neoliberalism is literally today's version of colonialism, and it was anti-democratic from the get-go. The other bookend I would mention, this book just came out a few weeks ago by Gary Gersel, he's a US citizen who teaches at Cambridge University. I'm not going to read the slide, but this book is an important book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order. Gersel is not saying that neoliberalism is over. He's just saying that as a political order, it's beginning to crack, and that those cracks begin to emerge, he said, in the 2008 financial crisis. We'll hear more from him in a short interview later. What Gersel calls a political order is something that Nancy Fraser has also talked about, and she talks about the alliance on the left and the right. So on the left, we have progressive neoliberalism in the United States. That's her term for it. And on the right is what she calls reactionary neoliberalism. So we need to understand that neoliberalism has been a bipartisan effort in the United States. Doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you're still supporting a neoliberal system. And in fact, as many have pointed out, most neoliberal policies were actually shaped by the Bill Clinton administration. We can talk about that later in the Q&A if you want to. I want to point out now that neoliberalism has three dimensions. These are, you might call them the three faces of neoliberalism. It is an economic order. It is also, though, a political order and a cultural order. So I want to talk about these three quickly in that order. As an economic order, it's, I think, best summarized by Kean Birch, who said that you can think of this maybe as the three-legged stool of neoliberalism. Its first leg is antitrust laws being suppressed or eliminated, and the emergence of global monopolies. So sometimes people ask me, so if you're speaking against capitalism, you must be against free markets. I'm actually much in favor of free markets, but that's not what we have under neoliberal capitalism. We have markets that are controlled by giant monopolies, including, as you know, gigantic banking systems. The second leg of that stool is, he said, the economy shifts from entrepreneurship to rentiership. I'm not sure if you should pronounce that rentiership. I think the French word is actually rentier. But the key actor is not the entrepreneur, as we're often told. The key actor is actually the investor, who appropriates value by fiat. The third leg of the stool then is that this whole system is enforced by a very sophisticated bureaucratic system of contracts and contract law. So I'll mention these again in order. One example, I think I'm preaching to the choir here about monopolies, but just an example, in the US in 1983, 90% of the media market was owned by 50 companies in the US. By 2018, that same 90% was owned by 5 companies. Those were the companies. We're now down to 4 because Disney has purchased 21st Century Fox. On the second leg of the stool, probably Andrew Sayer has defined this the best, what a rentier is. A rentier is a person who derives unearned income from ownership of existing assets or resources. So this is known in the political economy as a rentier. We often think of these as individual people, but I think it's better to think of them as corporations. Corporations, these large international corporations, are the rentiers of today. This book just came out this week. So this interview occurred October the 4th, a few days ago, of one of the authors. The book is Choke Point Capitalism. And Giblin points out companies use all kinds of tools to erect choke points to create an hourglass shaped market that have audiences or consumers at one end and creators or producers on the other end, with corporations squatting in the middle, controlling the access of each to the other. And then the last leg of the stool that Birch mentioned is contract law, spoken of best by Katerina Pister in the Code of Capital, where she points out that with the right legal coding, anything can be turned into capital, and lawyers are the keepers of those codes. She points out that the feudal calculus lives on and breeds, but its habitat is wealth today instead of land. The consequences are well known to us: job reduction and due to outsourcing, globalization, suppression of wages, increasing debt for the vast majority of households. Think again here how money is created. Corporations and powerful elites control governments, financial institutions, and of course, this leads to unprecedented economic inequality. I said it was an economic system. Now I'm only going to have one slide on neoliberalism as a political system, and point you toward the research of Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page at Princeton, a wonderful 2014 paper, an empirical paper, that concluded that in the United States, when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. I think that's about as emphatic as you can get. So, in other words, they traced bills as they flowed to the US Congress and discovered that for the average American basically has no input into that process and its outcomes. You have to be an extremely wealthy individual or a wealthy corporation to have effect on political policies. This is a big claim I'm making, but I'm going to stand behind it, that by systematically dismantling the public, as Noam Chomsky said early, turning it into a sack of potatoes, neoliberalism poses the most radical cultural change in human history. At no time in human history have we so radically reduced the public and atomized people into just an aggregate of individuals as much as we have today. Different people, I'm just pointing to resources here before I get to the impact on suffering. Again, Nancy Fraser has talked about this using Gramsci's idea of hegemony, which is a process by which it's really a narrative, a story that is told by the ruling class that makes its domination appear natural, installing its own presuppositions or worldview as the common sense of society. Back in 1966, Berger and Luckman, sociologists, made a similar claim about the symbolic universe, how a reality is constructed by assumptions that are socially based by power groups. And the symbolic universe of our time, of course, is neoliberal capitalism. And money lies at the core of its narrative. Money, as Desange talked about in her paper, is the beating heart of capitalism. It's the beating heart of the neoliberal system. Nigel Dodd is a sociologist at the London School of Economics. If you haven't read this book, it's not an easy read, but it's an important read, The Social Life of Money. He points out that money is not a commodity or an object or a thing. Instead, it is a social process. So we have to pay close attention to the mythology of money, the story told about it and the story that it tells, and to look at the implicit political theology of money. Political theology, by the way, is probably not a term you've heard before, but it's a particular species of theology that has nothing to do necessarily with the belief in a supernatural God. Instead, political theology looks at what Goodchild, who teaches in the UK, calls the valuation of values. What is the hierarchy of values in our social system, and how are those supported by certain metaphysical claims? And that exists even outside of what we call religion, just in society as a whole. So Adam Kotzko is a young theologian, written this book, Neoliberalism's Demons, and he says this, that neoliberalism is more than simply a formula for economic policy. It aspires to be a complete way of life and a holistic worldview in a way that previous models of capitalism did not. It is this combination of policy agenda and moral ethos that leads me to designate neoliberalism as a form of political theology. So there are many people writing today, including myself in the book that Stephen mentioned, that neoliberalism actually functionally acts like a religion. Lots of resources on this. This one came out a couple of years ago in International Political Sociology Journal. Wonderful article on the most specific one I've seen yet on how neoliberalism functions as a religion by making the market sacred and how that leads to post-truth politics. But bringing it out of the academy and back down to the ground, let's let Margaret Thatcher speak again. Another quotable quote from Thatcher is when she said in 1981, "Economics are the method. The object is to change the heart and soul." And that is exactly what neoliberalism has done, as I'm about to get to. But look at this quote and let's rephrase it in terms of monetary policy. So if bank money is the beating heart of today's capitalism, we could rephrase this to say bank money is the method. The object is to change the heart and soul. So we quickly get to how money is related to individual lives in everyday life on the ground at the granular level, as this man obviously got the message. The result of this, and this is my main point this morning, is a dramatic increase in suffering, both for human beings and for their entire environment, the planet. And back to the academy for a moment, this article just came out a few weeks ago. Usually when we do economic analysis in terms of the impact on society, we talk about GDP, we talk about economic growth, and we have, of course, had the flourishing of happiness studies. Happiness studies are all over the place. You can hardly read a self-help column, especially those supported by corporations, that don't talk about happiness and how we all need to overcome our obstacles and be happy. But these French scholars say, notice the last sentence of the abstract, we point out that lowering social suffering should take precedence over the pursuit of happiness. This is exactly my point this morning. We need to make the reduction of suffering the point of our social reforms and of social justice, not simply the pursuit of happiness. And we want to look this morning of how money functions in suffering, and therefore monetary reform is a critical component of the reduction of social suffering. Well, where does the suffering come from? I mentioned at the beginning that this is very complex. It doesn't come from any one place, but we can start by saying that it certainly does emerge in part from the radical economic inequality that neoliberal capitalism in general, but neoliberalism in particular, has caused. Wilkinson and Pickett are two epidemiologists in the UK. Back in 2009, they wrote a book called The Spirit Level, which was a meta-statistical analysis of several thousand empirical studies. And they raised the question of what is the correlation between economic inequality and social well-being? So they actually took the 21 wealthiest countries, economies on the planet, and asked the question, if we plot inequality using the Gini coefficient, how does that plot with these 10 that you see on the left, these 10 markers of social well-being? And the red line on the chart is the line of statistical significance. So it was statistically significant. And the USA, as you see, is up here at the very top. So we have, of the 21 wealthiest countries at that time, the largest GDP, but also the most of these 10 markers of social well-being. I'm a therapist, so notice that this includes mental illness, including drug and alcohol addiction. In fact, if you do plot just the mental illness aspect, mental illness, by the way, I think is a medical shorthand way of talking about individual human suffering or psychological suffering. But the line of statistical significance is even more pronounced when you look at that. Several speakers over the weekend in this conference have mentioned how COVID and the pandemic have exacerbated the problems that monetary reformers look at. This is on the left, an article that came out in Time in 2020, about a little less than a year after the pandemic started. And it notes that, like many of the virus's hardest hit victims, the United States went into the COVID pandemic racked by pre-existing conditions. This was, of course, true globally. But if you're just looking at the United States, the article cites a working paper from the Rand Corporation, which is where the chart on the right comes from, that between 1975, at the beginning of the neoliberal revolution, through 2018, $50 trillion of wealth was transferred in the United States from the bottom 90% of the population to the top 10%. Incredible transfer of wealth. And the money system that we have is the core of that inequality. Interesting chart. If you just look at the billionaires, this again is just the billionaires in the United States. I looked this up just yesterday on the internet, how many billionaires are in the United States. I believe the number it said was 780. So 780 billionaires in the US would fit in a rather small auditorium, right? This is a chart that shows how much the wealth of those 780 people increased in the first 18 months of the COVID pandemic. And if you look at the designations of money on the left, those 780 people increased their wealth over $1.5 trillion during the COVID, just the first 18 months of the COVID pandemic. Well, back to human suffering. So this is the amount of change in the United States of adults reporting symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorders, which, as you see, preceding COVID was at 11%. In January 2021, roughly a year later, it zoomed up over 30 percentile points of the number of adults reporting anxiety and depression. Now, I'm not saying that economic inequality is the only reason for this increase, but when you think about, as you know, what happened to the economy worldwide and in the US, first the stock market crashed, but then it came roaring back. So wealthy people were making money hand over fist a few months after COVID began, whereas the real economy had just crashed and people were having trouble surviving. So economic inequality and its aftershocks are certainly part of this figure. If you break this down by age groups, interestingly, the younger you are in the United States, the more COVID has impacted your mental health. So well over half of the adults in the US between 18 and 24 have been reporting anxiety and depressive disorder symptoms, compared to about 30%, which is still significant in people in my age group. I'm going to skip this slide. It's just restating that this is a cultural impact as well as an economic and political impact. And the cultural narrative of neoliberalism not only contributes to the volume of suffering, as I've been talking about so far, but I'm going to say moving forward, it also governs the particular texture of suffering. In other words, not just the intensity of suffering or the volume of suffering, but it has changed how we are suffering. I'll say more about that. And I'm saying that the cultural effects of neoliberalism alter individual psychology. So you might think of this talk I'm giving as connecting the dots between the larger social paradigm, the monetary system at the heart of that paradigm, social life in general, all the way down to the individual psyche, and connect all those dots together. That's what I'm doing. The effect on individual psychology was summarized well by Will Storr in another op-ed piece in the New York Times in 2018. He said the relentless focus on the individual, combined with an increasingly harsh economic environment for the ordinary person, has proved toxic for our mental health. We individualists are great at crediting ourselves for victories, but we're just as good at blaming ourselves for failure. And today, exacerbated by the rise of social media, more and more of us are feeling like failures. So what he's pointing to here, and I would add one more thing, part of the cultural narrative of neoliberalism is extreme individualism. Again, we've already been reduced to a sack of potatoes, atomized and separated from one another. Add to that, that's implied in this quote, the notion of meritocracy. The notion of meritocracy is that we're all responsible for our successes and failures as individuals. It sounds good, but it has a very destructive effect. And then add to that, what he does not mention here is the centrality of competition, that we're all competing with each other. So the sack of potatoes analogy is really not good enough unless you can imagine all of those potatoes having agency and competing with one another in the sack. That's where we are as individuals in this system. These four psychologists have written an important paper called The Psychology of Neoliberalism and the Neoliberalism of Psychology, which came out in the Journal of Social Issues. Actually, I recommend the entire issue of the Journal of Social Issues was on this very subject. But this article in particular is important. And I'm just going to use a chart in the article to summarize this granular effect. What is the impact of neoliberalism, and I would add its money system, on the individual psyche? So on the left, you see features of neoliberalism, and in the middle, the implication for psychological experience of individuals. So at the top, the radical abstraction of individuals from place, time, social, and material contexts that results in relational mobility and conditional identification. So it's very hard these days to get a social movement going, comparable to, say, the civil rights movement in the US in the 1960s, because all of us are encouraged to identify with groups conditionally, as long as it is enhancing our brand, enhancing our lives in certain ways. We will stay attached, but the minute it is inconvenient, we will leave. The second feature they talk about is the entrepreneurial self. So the exploration, innovation, and cultivation of self to create a marketable brand. Wendy Brown, a social analyst in California, talks about that neoliberalism has reduced us all as individuals to capitals. We're all our own little businesses, even if it's not monetized. I had a client about 3 years ago that came to a therapy session. He said he had just walked by a middle school playground that morning, and he saw two boys literally getting into a fist fight. So middle school, so they were probably, what, 12 or 13 years old? And one of them was screaming at the other, "You are stealing my brand." I would suggest when Gen Zers in our societies are thinking about themselves as brands, we're in a totally new social landscape, and one that is eroding our individual well-being as well as social. These authors also mention that neoliberal culture requires a growth imperative. So individual growth is not just an option, it's actually now a demand. We have to be growing. If we're not growing, we're failing. So there's this emphasis on self-expansion and personal fulfillment. And keep in mind here, if you're not growing in this system we live in, you're failing. So there's a psychologist who talks about depression as recursive shame-based spirals. So in the 1980s, when people came to me as a therapist to talk about their depression, and I asked why they were depressed, they would often point to external causes, something that had happened at work or to their job or something in their family. Today, when people who are depressed come to me, they don't often talk that way. Instead, they will talk about what is wrong with them, that they cannot break out of their depression. They blame themselves for being depressed. So today, as some have put it, people are not just depressed, they're depressed about being depressed and see it as a personal failure. This is true, by the way, even if people can trace the origin of their depression, say to a childhood trauma or a family dynamic, something external. Still, there's a nuance under neoliberalism that they blame themselves if they can't get back in control of themselves, no matter where the original seed of the depression came from. And the last thing, as you'll notice, is affect management. We're all supposed to have these high arousal positive affects, HAP states. And if you're not happy, if you're depressed, then something's wrong with you. And we indeed feel that way. One other empirical study I'll point to support this, data to support this, came out in the Psychological Bulletin in 2017. This is a very interesting study done, a longitudinal study over a period from 1989 to 2016. So exactly the period in which neoliberalism was gaining social traction. And it was done on almost 42,000 college students in the US, Canada, and Britain participated in this study. And as you'll see at the beginning of the abstract, this was the conclusion. From the 80s onward, neoliberal governance in the US, Canada, and UK emphasized competitive individualism, and people have responded in kind by agitating to perfect themselves and their lifestyles. And the result, of course, was tremendous rises in mental illness, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation have gone up among young people tremendously. I captured this meme off the internet just this week. I think it originated on Twitter. This individual, I think, shows the plight of what Dardo and Laval call the neo-subject, which means all of us under the neoliberal cultural paradigm. Here are the choices that we face under neoliberal cultures. And keep in mind that it's actually worse than it looks, because no matter which choice of these terrible options this individual chooses, they will feel responsible for the outcome of those choices. Two exhibits quickly of suffering in this age. One is loneliness. So Cigna in the United States hired Ipsos research firm to do this study, involved 20,000 adults in the US. By the way, I'm quoting a lot of US data, but I could just as easily reach for data from other countries and globally. It would mirror the same kinds of outcomes that we're looking at in the US. 20,000 adults in this US study, over half said that they felt alone sometimes or all the time. And notice that according to the study, the younger you are, the more likely you are to be lonely. And that this was a predictor of premature death, especially for young people. Suicide is not the only measure by any means, but it is, of course, a leading indicator, the canary in the coal mine that indicates how we are suffering in societies. And this is a chart of the increase of suffering from increase of suicides rather from 99 to the year 2016. It doesn't look dramatic until you take it down into percentages, which means that the suicide rate rose in the US in that period by 24% during those years. By the way, this contradicts the predominant theories about mental illness that are promulgated in the United States. Those theories would have it that depression, for example, is due to imbalances of serotonin in your brain or chemicals in the body, or perhaps to genetics. This cannot account for the drastic rise in suffering that we're seeing over the last 4 or 5 decades. We have to go back, I think, to social factors as the foundation for this suffering. So this I do talk about in my book. I mentioned earlier that it's changed not just the volume of suffering, but how we suffer. And in my book, I call this third order suffering. Well, what do I mean by that? First order suffering, I use to refer to the suffering that comes just from being human beings in every time and every age. We're subject to illness, we're subject to injury, we're subject to death. We're therefore subject to things like grief and mourning. It's baked in the cake with being human. Second order suffering, on the other hand, is suffering that we impose upon each other by betrayal, by murder, by robbery, by harm in some way, socially, by war, by colonialism. That's second order suffering. Third order suffering is not new in human history. It did happen at times that whole civilizations collapsed. But it happened then when society was not working. The difference today is that third order suffering increases precisely when capitalism is successful. So not when it's falling apart, but rather when it's doing its thing is when third order suffering becomes worse. So what is it? A third order suffering has three components. The first is that individuals, this goes back to Chomsky's comment about the erosion of the public and being turned into a sack of potatoes, that individuals lack traditioned communities today that support them and sustain a sense of belonging, even as they suffer. Along with that, the second element is that we are deprived of symbolic systems or narratives, or what the French scholar Dufour calls soteriological narratives, which includes narratives of salvation, in other words, which includes not just religions, but the narratives formed by unions, for example, paths forward to redeem society. Those have been systematically eroded. So we're deprived of a narrative to make sense of our suffering. And finally, this leads to the third element, which is the fragmentation of the self, a lack of self-cohesion. I can't tell you how many times people have come into my office compared to the 1980s and say, if they're older, they may say, I no longer feel like myself. I feel like I've lost myself. I don't know who I am. Or if they're younger, there's not even a comparative. They just say things like, I don't know who I am. I don't know what my identity is. I don't know what I'm here for. So this is what you put all these three together and you come up with what I call third order suffering. And this is particular to neoliberalism as a normative form of suffering. And I say in the book that it's become entangled with first and second order suffering. So today, if you're grieving, for example, which is first order suffering, it's tangled up with this lack of community and lack of narrative, so that grieving today looks different than grieving when you were part of an intact community. So I'm not the only one. I'm going back to Wilkinson and Pickett, who in a more recent book, 10 years later, 2019, make the same claim I'm making, that increases in psychological and interpersonal distress, along with a loss of conviction about creating a better society, is due to the, quote, almost uncontested rise of neoliberalism since the late 70s. Nice poster to illustrate this. Feeling sad and depressed? You might be suffering from capitalism. So I want to raise the question as I move toward the conclusion: are mental illnesses such as depression and addiction actually forms of resistance or protest towards social and political conditions? Are they, in other words, idiosyncratic vestiges of a collective suffering? Let's skip that slide. Might our suffering, I want to ask, if we pull it together and mourn collectively, might our suffering push us toward a new social order with a new monetary system? These are rhetorical questions, actually, obviously. Might money today come to embody mutual care rather than private interests? In other words, going back to the conflict between the longing for love and the struggle for the legal tender, can we have a new monetary system that eliminates that conflict, where money actually enacts or embodies care rather than private interests. And on a hopeful note, there are now cracks in neoliberalism that are widening and creating openings for change. The building, by the way, is in my hometown of Fort Payne, Alabama. If you could look through the building to the top of the mountain, you could see my sister's house, which used to be the home where my parents lived. The old mill was shut down many years ago, and today represents, I think, life in small towns under neoliberalism. In 1995, there were 136 sock mills in my hometown. It was called the sock mill capital of the world. Today, there are only 5. And I would suggest to you that in itself shows you why Donald Trump got elected in the United States. But back to the point, cracks are
All right, so I'm now here with Professor Gary Gerstle.
So I said we were going to have an interview with Gary Gerstle. So listen to him now talk about how this paradigm is unraveling and giving us a chance for reform. And I would add, including monetary reform. Listen to what he says. Oh, let me back up.
All right, so I'm now here with Professor Gary Gerstle. He is the Paul Mellon Professor of American History at the University of Cambridge, also the author of many books, including Liberty and Coercion, American Crucible, and of course, his latest, which we'll be talking to him about today, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, America and the World in the Free Market Era. Professor Gerstle, great to have you on.
It's nice for you to have me. Thank you.
So I want to
Obviously, we don't want a catastrophe on the scale of World War I and World War II to envelop our lives again, although the climate crisis and the pandemic have forced us to have compelled us to think that it's not impossible that something of that sort may occur. My point, however, here is that economic crises can develop to the point where capitalists can't control the outcome. And so I don't see this moment as a moment in which capital is in the driver's seat, managing things in their interest. If you're asking me, could that be the outcome of the crisis through which we're living? Could a neoliberal order or an order deeply privileging capital reemerge by the end of the 2020s in the United States and the world? The answer is yes, that is a possibility, but it's only one of several possibilities. And I think we are in a moment of inflection. We are in a moment of transition, and we don't really know what the shape of the world is going to be in 5 or 10 years.
Right.
And that means that not only should we not presume that capital is going to triumph, but we should also think that this is a moment when those who have other ideas for reorganizing the economy, for reorganizing politics, to step up and fight for what they believe in.
I think that's pretty much the perfect note to wrap up on.
I'll skip the end of that to just say that follow up what Gerstle says, that we certainly can imagine alternatives. Alternatives have existed before. And turning this back to monetary reform, Zerlanga and his book, The Lost Science of Money, notice the subtitle, The Mythology of Money, The Story of Power. So Zerlanga reminded us that money has taken many forms prior to its currently dominant form, and recognized that the mythology or story that money tells us is intrinsic to its power. A religious scholar, Karen Armstrong, this book just came out, Sacred Nature, tells us that we need more than science. We do need science, but science, she says, will not save us. We have to rediscover ourselves. We have to, she says, bow to the very thing that we've crushed, which is nature itself. So she says we need to reconnect with stories that are older than modernity. And I agree with that. I don't think we need to go, it's not that we need to restore the past as if the past was perfect. It was not. But she's asking the question, how can we go back and recover something of ancient wisdoms, the religions to be sure, but also ancient wisdoms generally. How can they help us form new stories to move us forward today, including in monetary policy? In my own tradition, speaking as a Christian clergyman, so I'm not saying we have to become Christians to do this. I'm just saying I'm reaching into my own tradition to reclaim a new vision of society, including of money. Jesus famously said, "You cannot serve God and money." I would say that Jesus was not making that as a statement for all time. Jesus was a Palestinian living in Palestine at a time when it was a colony of the Roman Empire. So when he made this statement, he was talking about a particular monetary system that was creating poverty and inequality, not very unlike what we're facing today. And in the middle, the sentence, "Forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors," is right in the middle of what the Christians call the Lord's Prayer, recited daily by millions of Christians across the planet. And I've said to church audiences when I talk to them about money, if we took that one line of the Lord's Prayer seriously, it would be the end of capitalism as we know it. This has been documented in a book by Hollis Phelps, which I highly recommend, but I'm going to speed forward in the interest of time. I do like that quote, though, that money actually transforms the world, turning the seemingly impossible into the possible. Like the biblical God, it creates the world in its own image. This, of course, can be for better or for worse, depending on the monetary system. I'm going to skip to the end and make my final points, because in the spirit of reaching back to ancient wisdom, I think we can ask, what would utopian money ideally look like? And I want to argue that we need to bring money back into conversation with the classical virtues, many of which I could mention here, but I'm just going to talk about 4 of them: hope, humility, love, and mourning. How would these reshape our society, but our monetary policy as well? As Adams and his co-authors I mentioned earlier observe, neoliberalism requires us to maintain HAP positive states, affective states, high arousal positive. And prominent among these is optimism, which assumes that if we try hard and follow the designated best practices, success is assured. In one of the incongruities of today's capitalism, as our souls are eroded by neoliberal culture, we are decidedly not optimistic. We lose faith in the system. Rather than optimism, I suggest that we practice hope. And ironically, despair is a precondition for hoping. The truth is, Gabriel Marcel asserts, that there can strictly speaking be no hope except when the temptation to despair exists. Today, hope feeds off the rot and decay of neoliberal excess. Sorting through the debris, hope is a hope against hope that arises from staring into the abyss or the darkness. The abyss, says Anyunte, conveys the unspeakable, both the unspeakable pain of the colonial wound and the unspeakable state of the self, who lives in a suspended present, awaiting for the unforeseeable future to unfold. This waiting is not, however, a paralysis. While hope is patient, insists Marcel, it is not passive. Hope is an active waiting, not unlike that portrayed in the Hebrew scriptures. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Moreover, in contrast to neoliberal optimism, hope is not for the me, myself. As we shall see in a moment, it dwells on the plane of love. It is a relational activity. Its most elaborate expression, says Marcel, is "I hope in thee for us." Put in monetary form, I would say, can we aspire to a monetary system rooted in relational hope rather than individual optimism? But hopeful waiting is not just engaged. This interdependent activity suggests something that we could easily miss, and that is humility. The spirit of neoliberalism is boastful, proud, arrogant, self-assured. It believes progress is inevitable and irresistible. Technology and innovation will bring never-ending growth and boundless prosperity. According to Margaret Thatcher's self-assured infamous slogan, there is no alternative. Capitalism, China Miéville insists, I quote, is catastrophe, exhausting, brutal, quite unrelenting. It will just not give us a minute, and it is too fucking loud, end quote. Those of us colonized by this system are increasingly aware that this is all a lie, but we do not counter arrogance with arrogance. We are aware that our knowledge is partial. In the words of the Apostle Paul, for we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. Our hope makes us utopians, but not blueprint utopians who have meticulously drawn out and thus know the path to the future. Instead, we are iconoclastic utopians who refuse to inventory the future. This is nowhere more evident than in imagining a new monetary future. Ever suspicious of the seductiveness and danger of imagery, we expend more energy breaking images than in making them. We trust our ears more than our eyes. In this regard, as the historian Russell Jacoby reflects, we are like the ancient Israelites. Like the future, God could be heard but not seen. Hear, O Israel, begin the Jewish prayers. As iconoclastic utopians, we are an apophatic yet subversive crew who are peculiarly fitted to our time. The opening lines of Ernst Bloch's Spirit of Utopia is a credo for us. I am, we are, that is enough. Now we have to begin. This humility means that we must resist a politics of certainty. So I would ask, might we listen for the resonances of a monetary order that walks softly, yet also lays down the big stick? The relationality of hope and humility point to their grounding in love. William Davies has observed that neoliberal logic gets stuck when it comes to love. Advocates of neoliberal systems will object that love is central to their positive psychology. But Adams and his team explore their understanding of love and conclude that relationships in this context become simply, quote, another site for self-expression, self-expansion, and pursuit of personal fulfillment. Like everything else, love is something neoliberalized subjects enter into as a personal choice and out of self-interest. But this is not the perspective reflected in classical understandings, where love is not a personal choice and is not limited to private, intimate relationships. Here, love arises as an ethical demand, an obligation. It is not chosen. It is already there. This love is inexplicable in the logic of neoliberalism. It simply cannot exist. Thus, it is immigrated to the margins, into the cracks of the neoliberal order. This love, whenever and wherever it occurs, is an act of resistance, defiance, and even rebellion. One way to oppose present-day colonization is to cultivate relationships that are, according to the logic of neoliberalism, absolutely useless. I should note in addition that love is not simply an individual act. It can inhabit a whole community or a society, or even be considered as having an ontological status. Put in monetary terms, do we not long for a monetary process emerging from a collective longing for the well-being of us all, from love, from care, rather than from individual self-interest? Love contradicts not only the logic of neoliberalism, but its ideal affects. The feelings of love are not always positive. As Miguel de Unamuno has observed, to love is to suffer. Why? Because the beloved is subject to alienation, disease, pain, exploitation, and death. To love is to be vulnerable, to the other's distress or death. There is no escape from this. Love leads inevitably to mourning, the last core virtue I will consider. If our love extends to Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, as it necessarily must, then we live our lives in the shadow of death. Living in community with the wretched means attending to the dying, to what Eric Kaysen calls the already dead, and thus to be infused with mourning. This makes no sense to neoliberal inclinations. The solidarity of the community we need looks backward. It is, as Johann Baptist Metz says, a solidarity with the dead and the vanquished. Does this virtue serve not simply Christians, of course, Metz was a Christian theologian, but potentially all just societies? More to the point in this conference, might money come to express our communal grief for the castaways of capitalism, rather than the festive celebrations of the global financial elites? Might our struggle for the legal tender be simultaneously an articulation of our longing for love? Can money tell a story about care rather than one of profit at all costs? It is utterly critical to realize that mourning is the root motivation for resisting and overturning a neoliberal monetary system. Revolution against the proud optimism of this structure begins not in the head, but the heart. Referring to the humility of what he calls an apophatic Marxism, China Miéville asserts, quote, "With such humility should come grief appropriate to the epoch. Don't mourn," goes the left injunction, organize. A bullying disavowal, he says. How can we organize except through mourning? And so I would conclude, knowledge is necessary, but it is not enough to know. Speaking is essential, but it is not enough to speak. Organizing is indispensable, but it is not enough to simply rise up. First, we grieve. We grieve for those who do not know the way, who cannot speak, who are too exhausted to rise up. In other words, for all of us. We grieve for those who have come before us and for the already dead. Exiled in this monetary desert in which we live, we are as the ancient matriarch Rachel, portrayed in the Hebrew Bible, weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. So we must first weep. Weep until the confluence of our tears become rivers of justice. Weep until the swelling of our tears become tides of steadfast love. Then our knowledge can become wise. Our words will come to us, but spoken in humility. Our actions will be prudent, and the paths before us will become clear. I want to end the screen share, and I think we have a few minutes left for some discussion. And I don't know, are Stephen or who is leading that?
I'm leading. I have the honor to do that for the next few minutes, Bruce. Thank you. I know there's a number of different questions out there. But we're going to build on this foundation, if we can call it that, with Bruce Wall going further along these lines. So to build that foundation, I would just like the questions now not to be so much about political economy or monetary reform or the NEED Act or AMRA or anything like that right now, or connections to what we're doing. I would like questions to be about Bruce's talk specifically, so that we can understand a few more things if you didn't understand something or you want a little clarification. So I would like all questions to be around clarification at this time, so that we can build up a layer. At the end, we'll have a panel and we'll get to people's questions, and it will go on even into lunch. So your questions will come around, but right now I just want questions around clarification of Bruce's talk, please. So I would ask everyone to put their hands down before and then rethink. If you got a clarification question, then put your hand up. And then I'll call on you, but it's got to be clarification about the talk because we're building something new now. Nick, you got a question about clarification? Please unmute. Oops,
Wait,
Tom.
I hit the wrong one. Am I on? You can hear me.
Oh, no, Tom. Yeah, I didn't see you, Nick. Okay, go ahead, Nick. About,
I hit Tom's button, I think, instead of my own. What a wonderful talk. And the clarification that I would like to ask Dr. Rogers-Vaughn to consider is we're fighting for a system of publicly created money. We basically have right now a system of bank created debt money. And so in referencing while you're going along in your talk, especially at the start, when you say money, 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 if you would say bank created debt money, the present system, to differentiate from what we're trying to get to, which is a system of publicly created money, a just system of money. So that's all I have to add. And again, just absolutely great talk. Thank you.
thank you, Nick. And Thomas Wilda.
Yeah, Bruce, thank you so much for that presentation. It was very, very moving. I just want to add that certainly the research into trauma at present, when we have so many people that have experienced sort of a chronic trauma. And in trauma, we know that the certain chemicals are released in the brain and in the body. Cortisol, norepinephrine, and a good number of others. And they tend to do a few things. They get us ready to either fight or run, but they also lower our immune system. And the thing is, today, I think we're all traumatized. The economic system has created a social and communal trauma that has increased all these the possibilities of all these diseases, because so many of our immune systems have been compromised due to chronic emission of these neurochemicals and chemicals. So I just want to throw that out there. What's always been sort of a movement to heal some of that trauma. It's always been human connection, and today it is human connection. The exact opposite of what the economic system does to us. It inhibits connection. So I just wanted to add that and just say, Bruce, thanks for such a great job. Thanks.
Just one comment on your comment, Thomas, and that is there are many psychoanalysts today that are writing about this, Lynn Layton being one of them. She and others have written a book in which they refer to the term a traumatogenic society. So they say today we are living in a traumatogenic society, the way society is structured. And I would add the way we do money, the way we create and allocate money is traumatizing to the vast majority of people. Yes.
John Mulholland, please. I'm going after new people first and any psychologists I see in the room. John, if you could unmute, there you go. Or unmute now. Great.
Okay, my question has to do with industrialization. I had a chat with a business ethics, econ ethics professor friend here at the University of Chicago who is concerned about greed and business practices and the whole 9 yards. And he had an interesting comment when I talked with him a week ago, when he remarked that Adam Smith started the conversation about capitalism and market economy just before industrialization started. And so when he wrote his books on economics and the start of the market economy, it was at a time when the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker saw each other in the byways, the alleyways, the streets of their little villages. But once trains started, once factories started, once industrialization started, then it wasn't necessarily money that was making a huge difference. It was the system of material production that was making the difference. So any thoughts on that would be welcome.
Sure. Well, industrial capitalism, as probably the best analyst of industrial capitalism was Karl Marx, regardless of what you think about other parts of his theory. He very thoroughly analyzed the industrial capitalism of his time, precisely the time, John, that you're talking about. What many people do not realize is that volumes 2 and 3 of Capital are about money. But Marx had a very difficult time putting his hands on the kinds of things that we money reformers today are talking about. So yes, under industrial capitalism, there was already traction in alienation, as Marx called it, alienation himself, alienation from the products of our work and from each other. So that was already true of industrial capitalism. What has happened under neoliberal capitalism, precisely because it functions as a whole world view, a religion, so to speak, it's changing the way we see ourselves and each other at a granular level. It's inside our heads in ways that industrial capitalism was not. So I think there are some very important changes going on under this new form of capitalism in ways that I just spoke to.
Okay, Mary Lou, can you unmute?
Yes, thank you so much, Bruce. Have so much gratitude for all the weaving you did with that. I wanted to clarify, you were talking about the politics of certainty and uncertainty, and it sounded like that was coming from a perspective of, I guess, imbuing humility. And at the same time, from a psychologist standpoint, I was wondering, like, in that state with the marginalized people, there's probably even greater pressure to seek and grasp for security. So yeah, what could you recommend in terms of the psyche's effect of that?
Sure. Well, very quickly, it's a wonderful question. I do think there's a difference between humility and insecurity. So I'm not saying that all of us need to be more insecure. I'm not even saying that we can't speak strongly about the convictions we have and the values that we're promoting, for example, in monetary reform. But by humility, I'm saying something about let's not claim to know more than we know. Let's not claim to know, for example, let's suppose we have the opportunity to enact monetary reform. Let's not suspect that we know everything that's going to happen as a result of those reforms. We all will have to build the plane while we're flying it, right? It's not necessary to have every detail known in advance. But the other thing I mean by humility is let's not be killing each other, over the differences that we have. Let's honor those differences. One of my favorite books that came out recently is from a Mennonite pastor. She is in North Carolina, And she's referring to the passage where Jesus says, love your enemies, bless and curse not. And the title of the book is How to Have an Enemy. So I think it's important for us today to know how to have an enemy. So speak strongly your values and even fight for them. You know, have an enemy, but that's different from destroying the enemy. So I'll stop at that before I start preaching. I can preach, but I'll stop.
Thank
thank
you,
you.
Mary Lou. And last question will go to Franz, and then we'll go on to Bruce Wall. And write down your questions. If they're connected to the larger picture, write them down. We'll come back. I'm going to ask Bruce's to come back, and then I'm going to do a little afterward, my little take from being able to work with them so that I can share that with you too. And then we'll go into lunch, and there can be more questions along this line. It's a very rich area, and it's good stuff. So Franz, did you want to get the last question in on this?
Yes. First of all, I think this was really a very profound presentation. And I think the greatest pressure, the greatest kind of impact if people start following what you are doing. And so I decided that in my writing about the Unitarian Universalist theology about money, I'm really going to use you very profusely. That is one. And another way, also, I hope to include some of your thoughts in my presentation this afternoon. That is one. But the real reason that I'm making my comment, the next comment, is this particular book.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering whether you are including this kind of jubilee year and going back to the economies in the Assyrians, how they had their safety valves. And so I think that would really enrich our thinking about the whole new economic system and monetary system.
Thank you, Franz. I have that book and I've read every page of it. And there's something it's come up in this weekend in the conference. There's some things we might disagree with Michael Hudson about when it comes to monetary reform, but he has certainly done a wonderful job on the history of debt. And that book is a tremendous contribution, I think. And my thought is called "And Forgive Them Their Debts." And it shows Jesus cleansing the temple right there on the front of the book. And as far as I know, Michael Hudson's not a particularly religious person. I have no idea, but he's certainly drawing upon the old traditions about debt, the clean slate, Andurarum, as he calls it, as it was called in Assyria. Yeah, I'm actually working on thoughts for a next book myself, for a sequel to the book on caring for souls in the neoliberal age. And if I get to write it, it's going to be about money. So that's in the works, and that book is a contribution to it.
Before we go on, Franz, can you just give the title of that book? Because I don't know if the title, you didn't get to show the title as much. Can you just read the title?
And no, ... and forgive them their debts. Exactly what Bruce was talking about.
Okay.
And then the subtitle is important: Lending, Foreclosure, and Redemption from the Bronze Age Finance to the Jubilee Year.
Very good. And the Jubilee starts, oh, I'm forgetting that emperor, but around 1800 BC, that Hudson begins to describe those Jubilees, and that may go right up into what is it, Shriver, and right at the turn of this millennium, to try to reinstitute jubilees with this new millennium.